Yes, so today I'll try to tell you about some of the challenges, why I'm excited about this field, what we can do, opportunities, issues, and a few examples of how we address some of these issues. Talking about a treasure trove chest, so you'll understand about what this is about. And so to start with, just to give you an idea of the size of what we're talking about. So you probably all know what an exabyte is. It's pretty big, so it's like a million terabytes. So already many of those large hard drives that you have. What about 10,000 exabytes? It's pretty big. Do you have any idea what this is? No idea. So it's the predicted quantity of healthcare data by next year and growing at 36% yearly. And so to give you, or try and have an idea of how large this quantity of data is, consider the distance between Earth and the furthest planet in the solar system, Neptune. So it's about 4.6 billion kilometers. And imagine that you're piling sheets of paper. Each sheet of paper represents 1 byte. Do you have an idea how far you can go? Just intuitively, you know?
1/3?
You could actually go 1 million times from Earth to Neptune. Crazy, huh? And that's next year. So just to say that we have lots of data to deal with. Quantities is one issue. It's just one among many other ones. From multiple different sources, most of the storage capacity is for imaging, but other unstructured forms of data like text are also very important. I'll tell you about that. And this continues growing with the adoption of electronic health record systems. Also, what's important is that we're already exceeding human cognitive capacity. So there's just too much data and of too much diversity and complexity to deal with completely, to really understand what we're dealing about, and more push to be able to reuse this data for research, to support clinical decision support. And also we have more and more capacity to process this data, analyze it, reducing costs. So we have more opportunities and resources to do so. But at the same time, we also encounter more and more problems, like patient confidentiality. So when we talk about clinical AI, that's a key component. Privacy breaches, confidentiality breaches, more and more stories coming out with hundreds of thousands or even millions of patient records leaked. And then you have recent stories with, when going to the public, generative AI algorithms that cause stupid errors, that give completely messed up advices or biased, seriously biased advices. So problems, more problems to deal with. And then characteristics of healthcare data. And so the rest of the presentation will be more about that. How data is, where it comes from. And a key aspect is that clinical data is generated in a very different context than, for example, scientific publications, biomedical data, etc. It's to document what's happening or done to a patient. For a physician to remember themselves, or maybe for a few other colleagues, that's about it. So that's when we talk about text often. Imaging is also important. Because of these, and I'll tell you a bit more about that, it's data that's difficult to process. It's data that is inconsistent of multiple formats, multiple terminologies, heterogeneous systems that don't share data. So a large variety and large quantity. And this is just an overview of the types of data we can deal with. Some of it is structured. Actually, about 80% of the volume is unstructured. So the proportion here, left and right, is not really correct. But this is what I consider being really a treasure chest trove. It has so much value, detailed, rich information, and most of it is embedded in the unstructured parts of this data. So most of it, 80% as I said, and it's often text if we focus on that. If you go all the clinical documentation, almost all of it is unstructured. It's just more flexible, easier to use for physicians. And I agree with that. You know, I had to use it too as a physician. Imaging, same thing, prescription. And then if you go more towards the administration, then it becomes more structured and coded, because you have to, you know, be reimbursed for what you do, obviously, for insurance purposes, et cetera, and statistical analysis. So if we consider the majority of that, which is unstructured text. There are multiple characteristics that are very important to understand, I think, and why most of the tools that you see now being used don't work well, if at all, with clinical text. One is that, again, because of what I said, because it's just to remember things and convey some information, it's often abbreviated, very short. Here you have some examples in English. If you're interested, I can explain what it means afterwards, but it would take a bit of time. And the problem is that not only it's abbreviated, but these abbreviations have different meanings between specialties, between hospitals, between people, even within the same document. That's like one example, PT. At the beginning, it means patient. In the history of present illness, it's a discharge summary here. Then in labs, prothrombin time, that's a coagulation test. And then it's physical therapy in discharge instructions. So if you just go, text matching, etc., you will have all sorts of different false positives. The text is often ungrammatical, so you don't have a verb, you don't have punctuation, you have misspellings. Like in one study, we found 21 different ways to misspell lisinopril, angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitor. And just a letter, one letter, can make a huge difference. Like this is a photo I took in Cape Town. So if you haven't pinpointed what the problem is, it makes a whole difference what was missing here, obviously. And then the context where you extract the information from, because in clinical data, information is often negated because it's very important to say this is absent, this can be excluded, it's denied, etc. So it's very frequent and it's very important to recognize. So like these examples, or it's about someone else, about someone in the family, about something that might eventually, if it happens, then you should do something particular. It's hypothetical, or it's long in the past. And it's mentioned in different places in clinical notes and in different sections. If you find mention of a medication under medication allergies, you don't want to think that the patient is taking it, or you hope the patient is not taking it. So like all the information you have in red here is not current about the patient. It's either absent or historical or someone else, etc. So that's also something really important to recognize when you get this information. And then you often have tentatives to represent or recreate tables, etc., with spaces and tabs and others. So when you process that, you have all sorts of problems. Like what does this 61 here mean in this abbreviation? Oh, you don't see my pointer, okay. Anyway, here. This is just an example. And then you have templates also. It's supposed to make it easier to document care, but then what do you do with this data when you process it? And again, I mentioned already that the meaning can be different between specialties. So like MD, for example, it has 42 different possible meanings in the UMLS Specialist Lexicon. That's a useful resource for that. So in clinical text, most of the time, it's the signature of the author, MD, medical doctor, etc. But in scientific publications, biomedical text, it can mean all sorts of different things and not medical doctor. So if you use your biomedical trained system in clinical text, you're going to have a lot of false positives and problems. And then, last but not least, the key issue is that we're dealing with patient data. So it's data that has to be protected, that has restricted access, and because of that, the availability of data sets to share and collaborate with, etc., is very small, very limited. It's very difficult to share data also if you collaborate with others between different institutions. And if you want to obtain access to clinical data, most of the time you have to be working in some healthcare institution or tightly collaborate with them. So it's difficult to access. So with that said, I'll tell you about a few examples of what I've been working on. Examples that are all of them applications of AI and most of the time natural language processing to make it possible to access this treasure trove of unstructured clinical text data. So the first one was part of the response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this was at a time when I was professor at the Medical University of South Carolina in South Carolina in the US, in Charleston. So like all of you probably, in March 2020, we don't know what's coming, just that it's a crisis, and we had to, in an emergency, respond very quickly to capture and be able to analyze data that we didn't have before. And we had no idea that things would evolve a certain way, so we had to start very quickly. And we started with a telehealth system that patients could access, because suddenly you had thousands of patients all at the same time having symptoms, contacting the healthcare system, overloading everyone. So they could just indicate symptoms they had, what they had not, exposure, et cetera, and then the system would export some data to the patient. It would give them some advices and then maybe allow them to come and visit the emergency room or something like that. But we wanted to use this data. So by using then extracting information from this system that was not very well integrated, but we had to deal with that, we built a whole workflow and system in just 10 days to capture data from multiple sources, from the telehealth system, from everything we had in the electronic health record system, and the clinical data warehouse that added also information from other sources. And then we had to develop also some AI application and NLP application to extract various types of clinical information from these resources, all in a dedicated data mart that would then be accessible to clinical researchers for operations and also for research applications. And we also connected it very quickly among the first institutions in the US to a very large national resource called the National COVID Cohort Collaborative, or N3C, that now includes about almost 9 million COVID-19 cases, more than 20 million patients across the US at the time. So, and as part of this effort, the component that included the most AI was the one that was doing natural language processing. So in that case, again, we had to be really quick. And so we came up with a system that combined reused components from other systems we had, developed new ones because we had to extract new types of information we were not focusing on before, and then more importantly, integrate this into this operational workflow that we had running in real time that would, every time we got a new clinical note, process it, extract the information, store it back into this data mart that can be used for operational purposes, et cetera. So it was looking at these notes, extracting sections, because again, as I mentioned, it's very important to recognize where you get your information in clinical documentation, and then extracting all sorts of concepts, symptoms, exposure, comorbidities, the treatments the patient had, et cetera, all normalized, so link with mostly US resource, the UMLS Metathesaurus, that is also multilingual, but with concept unique identifiers and all the local context, whether it was present or absent about the patient, about someone else. The sister also started coughing and had fever or whatever, and medications, and all exported into this data mart. And then we realized also that we had something really useful and interesting. We had all this clinical information very early, before even the patients were seen by a physician, but also afterwards in this same data sets, data mart, we had all the test results and SARS-CoV-2 test results, positive or negative. So we developed predictive analytics to predict the outcome of the SARS-CoV-2 diagnostic test before even the patients would even do it, based on the clinical information, the symptoms they had, the exposure history, et cetera. And then used it to optimize the care for those patients. So we also tweaked it different ways to make it either more sensitive, even if we had more false positives, or more precise, at the risk of missing some cases. More sensitive to give advices, data-driven advices to patients, instead of the rule-based one that you had from Apple, Google, and the CDC in the US and other ones. That was clearly more accurate. Or to allow pool testing. So for patients, we had advices like this that they could follow. And then for pool testing, what we would do is that at some points, the labs were overflowing with tests to do, so they could not keep up with the testing. And with pool testing, you combine multiple samples and you do one test. Problem is that if it's positive, you have to redo all of them independently to figure out which one is positive. If it's negative, you can say all of them are negative. And at the time, the positivity rate was too high. Above 5–10%, you cannot do that. It's not worth it in terms of efficiency. So what we did is use this predictive analytics and only do this pool testing when we predicted the patients to be negative. And then in this subpopulation, we had a much lower positivity rates, and this made the testing, pool testing possible. So this is just one example of what we could do using AI applied in the clinical field in real time. Another one is to help find patients eligible for clinical trials. So that's also an issue, an important issue, especially in some fields, in oncology and other ones for adults. Only a very small proportion of patients who might potentially or could be eligible to participate in clinical research are recognized as eligible and then eventually enroll for multiple reasons. And that causes all sorts of problems, the main being that many clinical trials cannot complete, have to be terminated, all the invested money and efforts is wasted, risks taken by patients for nothing, and then it's just lost opportunity for new knowledge or often also a therapeutic opportunity, especially in cancer care, for example. And most of the time, or often, it's because we're just not aware that a patient could be eligible for a trial we never heard of. There are many trials open, and one of the advices, options to help with this, advised by multiple organizations, is to try and find patients using their medical record. All the clinical data that we have, or other hospital-based databases, registries, etc. And so that's what we started working on, to do a task that, in theory seems pretty simple. So you have a clinical trial. You're not supposed to read that, but it's just to give you an idea how it looks like in clinicaltrials.gov. So a description with eligibility criteria that might look like this one. This is just one example for breast cancer. That's on one side. It's all text. It's not coded anything, so it can be expressed any way the researcher wants. And then on the other hand, you have a patient record, multiple nodes, tons of data, with matching information. So information that actually means the same, but is often expressed completely differently at different levels of granularity, etc. And so the task here is to combine all these criteria from the trial description with the corresponding clinical record data and try and find patients that are eligible or could be eligible. The aim here is to be very sensitive to try and find all those who might be eligible. So that's the search, examining in details by a clinical trial coordinator, for example, can be done on a much, much smaller subset of patients, much more likely to be eligible than just fishing in a huge pond like the hospital healthcare system. So we did some pilot studies. The first one focused on breast cancer with only 2 trials with different eligibility criteria, and had a system that on one side extracted eligibility criteria from clinicaltrials.gov, that's the main resource in the US, and on the other side from the clinical data warehouse, mostly clinical notes with some application, NLP application that extracted all this information, and then algorithms that compared the two. So the extraction of information, we tried different methods, etc. Machine learning-based methods, so shallow machine learning, support vector machines was the most accurate. Varies a lot depending on the types of information. And then with the alignments, algorithms, also machine learning-based approaches worked the best and allowed for example, this one based on SVMs also to have a mean average precision of about 35%. So this means that among all the patients you find, about that proportion are actually eligible. So you might think, oh yeah, that's not very high, but it means for those using this kind of tool to find patients eligible that they can focus on a much, much, much smaller subset of patients, again, to then look deeper into the records and then do additional testing, etc. So it's already interesting. And then we expanded that to more different types of trials, and more importantly also investigated opportunities to integrate with the clinical workflow, because this is where it would become really interesting. So when you have, at the top trial descriptions, data warehouse, and then some matching algorithms, and you store this information, you can give access to that to researchers so they can directly search and more easily find patients for trials. But more interestingly, you can notify providers. A physician, the first time they see a patient, they look at the patient record and they have information available that tells them, oh, this patient might be eligible for this trial, and also patients. If they're interested in participating, look for opportunities, you can go through some patient portal and notify them, and then they can ask the provider or the physician when they see them, etc. So we didn't integrate that. There was still a pilot study, started investigating it with another NLP application, similar architecture, but again, it had to be adapted to different types of information. And then some interfaces, very simple ones that allowed searching for this information. So just querying for a trial and then seeing all the matching patients. And then I think what's very important, be also able to verify, to see the source, because that's one problem also with this approach. You have to be able to verify that what the algorithm tells you makes sense. You know, if you find patient X might be eligible for that, you can see which eligibility criteria were matched, and then you can see exactly where in the record this information was found and how, and verify by yourself, and then say, okay, this one we'll look at and continue the work. And the last one I will tell you about is aiming at protecting the privacy of this information to do clinical text de-identification. So just for clarification, there are different terms used for this approach in general. So what we used is the de-identification term from the US HIPAA safe harbor privacy rule. So it means that you have to find specific types of identifiers and then remove or hide them for the data to be considered de-identified. In Europe, or Switzerland, there's no direct equivalent. Pseudonymization is probably what's closest, but in the US, it's again defined a little bit differently. What's important is that it's not anonymization. And I think the distinction is important, because anonymization means that you cannot link the data back to a patient identity or at huge cost and unfeasible. When you have clinical text, even if you remove all the identifiers, you find all of them, the names, the identifying social security identifier, phone number, address, you're still left with all the clinical information, which is what you want to have. But all this set of information for a patient is very likely to be unique. And just because of that, make the data re-identifiable. If you have another data set with the clinical information and some identifier, you could figure out who this record belongs to. So if you would want to try and anonymize that, do some approaches like what you can do with structured data here, randomization or generalization algorithms, you would probably lose most of the value of the data. So for unstructured text, it's more pseudonymization approaches like de-identification, as I mentioned, that you can do. And doing that manually has been done, obviously, it's still done, you know, like the big black marker hiding the names and things like that. It's not very efficient, obviously. So we use natural language processing to do that in two stages. First, find these identifiers, and then do something with them. Remove them to replace them with a tag or something, or asterisk or whatever. But what's better is what you see here is what we call PII resynthesis, or identifiers resynthesis, or replacing them with realistic surrogates. So a name with another randomly selected name, and do it consistently across the record. All the dates, you shift them the same random time periods, so that the result is that you have a record that looks like the original, and that has actually a bit more anonymity, meaning that the risk that you recognize the patient is lower. If you had missed some information, identifiers are going to hide in plain sight, so you will not be able to tell if the identifier has been changed or not. So it's more secure. This is just a list of the types of identifiers to focus on. And so this is work that we focused on for many years, starting at the Veterans Health Administration. That's among the largest healthcare organization in the world, in the US, that takes care of all the veterans of armed forces. At the time, there was nothing, so it's this Bob system here on this overview of the past 15 years of some of the research, best of breed system. There was nothing that worked well on clinical text there, so we looked at everything that existed and then experimented for each type of identifier with multiple different types of methods and algorithms to figure out what worked the best, and then put it all together in the system that was the most accurate possible. And then continued working on that to result in one system that has approximately this architecture that combines pattern matching, dictionaries, shallow machine learning, deep neural networks in an ensemble methods to have a system that's as sensitive as possible, but also with relatively good positive predictive value. And so that's just examples of how doing an ensemble method with the last two rows, you have better accuracy than any one of the combined algorithms. And also recently, the system was compared to other existing systems. Again, this is all for English, or again, just as a comment, because applying it here in French or German or Italian, whatever, means more adaptation. But it was the most accurate with some openly or publicly available. Corpora, it's released open source now. So if you want to play with it, feel free to do so. And that's it for me.